Hey, good evening, Castlers. LFO7 here to preview the upcoming 2022 Independence Day Tournament. We are continuing with our Ydtd versus the rest of the field series this evening with Jackpotja101. Now, this is an interesting rivalry. Chess.com has Jackpotja101 finishing 11th out of 23 players. In 2 career games against one another, Ydtd won the first game and the second game was a draw. Both games took place in the 2021 Happy New Year tournament. We will look at the most competitive game according to the computer engine. This game was completed on March 12th, 2021. Ydtd had white pieces and Jackpotja101 had black. Ydtd started off with, what else? Pawn to d4. Something tells me the Queen's Gambit is coming. Jackpotja101 responded with pawn to d5. And then, surprise, surprise, pawn to c4, the Queen's Gambit. You then get knight to f6. C takes d5, knight takes d5. e4 kicks the knight away to b6. These are book moves. Knight to f3, pawn to e6, pawn to a3, bishop to e7, knight to c3, pawn to a6, bishop to d3, knight c6, Jack threatens to win material on the d4 square. Bishop to e3, Ydtd defends the attacked pawn. Jack then castles kingside, Ydtd castles kingside. King h8, queen to c2, knight to d7, rook a to d1. Pawn to b5, pawn to b4, bishop b7, rook f to e1, pawn to h6, pawn to e5, knight a7, bishop to e4, bishop takes e4, and knight takes e4, an equal trade of bishops, although the computer would have rather had Ydtd recapture that bishop with the queen. As you can see, the eval bar is up to almost 2 material points. As opposed to capturing with the knight, now it's just an even game. But anyway, after knight takes e4 was played by TD, Jackpotja101 played pawn to f5. Knight to c5, knight takes c5, d takes c5, equal trade of knights. But now this move has revealed an attack on Jack's queen on the d8 square. Queen to c8 moves the queen from the attack. Knight d4, pawn to c6, pawn to f4, king h7, and queen to b3. Ydtd threatens to win material with the d4 knight also attacking the e6 square. So Jack plays rook to e8. Bishop f2 is played by Ydtd. You might be thinking, why not just take the e6 pawn immediately with your knight? Well, because you want to prevent the bishop to h4 threat, which attacks your rook. So excellent move from Ydtd with the bishop to f2 move. Bishop f8 gives protection to the e6 pawn. Rook to d3, pawn to g5, f takes g5, h takes g5, equal trade of pawns. Knight to f3 attacks the unguarded g5 pawn. King g6 defends it. Pawn to h3 prevents the g5 pawn moving to g4 and attacking the knight. Queen c7, Jackpotja101 connects his rooks. Ydtd doubles his rooks on the d file. Rook to e7, rook d6, Ydtd looking to win material on the e6 square. Rook a e8 is an excellent move from Jackpotja101 as it sends another defender over to protect the e6 pawn. Queen to e3, TD threatens the pawn on g5. Bishop to h6 rectifies the problem. Then you get queen to d3, knight c8 hits the rook. TD then plays rook to d7, rook takes d7, queen takes d7, queen takes d7, rook takes d7, equal trade after the exchange. Jack then plays knight to e7, knight d4, TD attacking the e6 pawn again. Jackpotja101 responds with pawn to g4, which is a blunder because he left his e6 pawn hanging. But Ydtd must have missed it because he played h takes g4 instead of knight takes e6, which was the best move. F takes g4, Jackpotja101 recaptures. And then knight takes e6, Ydtd goes up a pawn in the exchange. Jackpotja101 then plays the great move of knight to f5, which, with ideas of, let's continue with this. He played knight f5, then you continue with knight to d4, pawn to g3, and that's the idea. You want to grab the bishop and make this an even game in position. So you continue with knight takes c6, g takes f2, grabbing that bishop, and recapture with the king. And now you have an even position. The eval bar is at even, 0.021. But let's see what was actually played. Okay, so Ydtd played knight to c7. Jackpotja101 snags the free pawn on e5 with his rook. It's back to an even game material-wise. You then get pawn to g3, bishop to e3, king f1, takes, equal trade of bishops. Rook e3, jackpot with a double attack on the pawn on a3 and the pawn on g3. So Ydtd plays knight takes a6, capturing a pawn. Rook takes a3, played by Jackpotja101, is a missed win. According to the computer, he should have played rook takes g3. Like so. Continuing with the line, rook to d8. Rook takes a3. And then rook g8 check. King f7. Rook takes g4. And rook takes a6. Jackpotja101 is up a piece and has a winning position in the endgame. That eval bar is almost at 5. This is winning. Instead, Jackpotja101 played rook takes a3, and Ydtd followed with knight to b8, attacking the c6 pawn. Rook takes g3, Jackpotja101 goes up a pawn, knight takes c6, Ydtd equalizes in material. Rook h3, knight e7 check, knight takes e7, rook takes e7, equal trade of knights. Rook b3, Jackpotja101 now threatens the unguarded b4 pawn. Rook e3, Ydtd is willing to concede the pawn in exchange for putting his rook underneath his c5 pawn and marching it up to promotion. Rook takes b4, Jackpotja101 goes up a pawn again. Rook to c3, rook a4. Jackpotja101 is now going to try to stop the pawn promotion with his rook. Pawn to c6 from TD, rook a to e8, pawn to c7. Ydtd's pawn is one square away from promotion. But Jackpotja101 plants his rook right on top of the pawn to prevent it from advancing even further. Rook c5, Ydtd now threatens the hanging b5 pawn. Pawn to b4, Jackpotja101 now advancing his passed pawn. This is getting exciting. King to g3, Ydtd going after the isolated g4 pawn. Pawn to b3, king takes g4. Pawn to b2, Jackpotja101 is one square away from getting a queen. But Ydtd solves that problem by putting his rook on b5. Rook takes c7. Rook takes b2. Each eradicates each other's potential queens, and this is definitely looking like a draw. Rook c4 check from Jackpotja101. You then get king to f3, king f5, rook b5 check, king e6, rook a5, rook c3 check, king e2, rook h3, king to d2, king d6, rook to g5, rook h2 check, king to d3, rook h4, and it was in this position, move 62 in fact, that both players agreed to a draw. This was a good game. Both players had chances of winning, but in the end, the game resulted in a draw. There was a bit of controversy at the end, though, because after the game, Jackpotja101 admitted to Let's Castle reporters that Ydtd wasn't all that impressive. In fact, he said he had a tougher time with Ydtd. Ydtd was the 3-time Let's Castle title winner who inexplicably left the club. When Ydtd got wind of this, he got heated and responded with, "What? He's lucky he got a draw for me in that game. I can't wait to get my paws on him the next time." However, Jackpotja101 then took a year-long sabbatical from chess, so Ydtd never got a chance to play him again. But Jackpotja101 has returned from his sabbatical. And if they are both selected to be in the same playing group, this will be an interesting matchup to say the least. Well, that's going to do it for this evening's podcast. I'm Ydtd7 saying stay tuned, and I'll see you soon.